You are watching First Edition, returning now to one of our top stories. Penny Wong will visit China, meeting her counterpart Wang Yi on Wednesday on the 50th anniversary of Australia-China relations. It follows the Prime Minister's talk with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 in Barley last month. Joining me now live is former DFAT Australia-China Council scholar Andrew Phelan. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. How significant is this visit, particularly after years of frosty relations?
That remains to be seen, Danica. When we look at the Xi-Albanese meeting in Bali, the press received it warmly, but shortly after that, and it was a 32-minute meeting, which largely pro forma friendly comments. And as soon as the meeting was over, the Chinese side said, well, we want good conditions for foreign direct investment in Australia. We want our deals to be able to go through. And I think that speaks to the point that we often talk about trade, but we should be talking about trade and FDI in the same sentence because they're two different sides of the same coin. So, the Chinese ambassador here, Xiao has often spoke about meeting halfway. First question I'd be asking is, why isn't Wang Yi coming here, or why aren't we at least meeting halfway in Singapore? But I remain hopeful. I think Penny Wong has the right attitude going in, which is, you've got to drop these sanctions on our crayfish, our barley, our wine, if we're going to get things, if we're going to be fair income about getting things back on track.
You mentioned these sanctions on Australian exports, but what does China want from Australia in these negotiations as well, do you think?
Well, China doesn't tend to give something away without getting something in return. But I think these sanctions were placed in unilaterally as a signal to Australia to punish us. I'm not sure whether Beijing really did their homework on how they'd stack up in a case that went before the WTO. That remains to be determined. But Beijing, as some of the stories earlier on mentioned, is sort of seeking friends now. It's toned down the wolf warrior language somewhat. That doesn't mean it's altered course in its grand strategy or its military assertiveness and so on. So it remains to be seen. I'm hopeful, for the sake of our primary producers, that Beijing says, we're going to drop these. I kind of doubt that's going to happen, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah, we certainly will wait and see. The other issue is, of course, there are Australians detained in China, including an Australian journalist. Does that get raised?
Absolutely it will. There's 2 Australian citizens there. And the nature of their detention is vague at best. Cheng Lei's been in horrendous conditions for a long period of time. This is a similar case to the case of the 2 Canadian diplomats and hostages that were held over the Huawei issue, a tit-for-tat kind of hostage diplomacy, and we're seeing something similar. They're Australian citizens. We want them home. There's no doubt Penny Wong will push that case and push it as hard as she possibly can.
The other issue I want to talk to you about is, of course, the COVID situation in China. We saw over the last few weeks there have been some restrictions that have been eased, and we're hearing today that there's now doubts surrounding the official COVID death toll in China. Will we ever know what is actually going on?
Yeah, well, my background, Danica, is in medtech, and I worked in the infection control space post-SARS. I was visiting hospitals all over Asia and talking to WHO people and infection control specialists in hospitals. I've been in operating rooms in hospitals all over China. My last trip to China was for a company called Gcon Bio, which makes prefabricated clean rooms for the biopharmaceutical manufacturing industry. And Pfizer was an early investor in them. And Pfizer was able to get their COVID vaccine to market in half the time because they didn't have to build their own plant and equipment. So with that background, I've been following the pandemic super closely from the get-go. And if you remember in the beginning, the R0 score for COVID was, which is the measure of transmissibility, was maybe 2 or 3. At its worst in the US, it was about 11 in North America with the Omicron strain. Right now in China, it's 16. So it's spreading like wildfire and the system can't cope. China, as a previous report mentioned, has much fewer ICUs per capita than we do here, and therefore much fewer intensivists. So the system is completely overwhelmed, and China will the death toll will effectively become a state secret. So the security forces will control the narrative as best they can, but they can't prevent footage from leaking out of the country. So we know it's gone. It's basically, the vaccines haven't worked. China has a litany of adverse responses from vaccines. Lockdowns are only as good as the lockdown, and that was preventing economic growth. People getting angry and frustrated. Last time we spoke, people were demonstrating in the street. And so now they've taken the lid off, and it's a let it rip strategy. And as Eric Dingle-Fung, a Harvard-trained epidemiologist, has said, the death toll could be anywhere between 500,000 to the millions.
Wow.
So it's going to be a very rough ride for China over the next little while until we see a peak in the virus.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a very precarious situation. Andrew, Phelan, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Danica. Thank you.